Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I am excited to be here today. And I don't know if I'm really the right person to be doing this interview, but nevertheless, I'm here today with Jill Stoddard, who is the author of Imposter No More, Overcome Self-Doubt and Imposterism to Cultivate a Successful Career. Jill, I really don't know if I am well qualified to interview you or not, but welcome to the show.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for having me. It sounds like you're having a little bit of imposterism about your interviewing right now.
Yes, I was just joking a little bit. If anything, I suffer from perhaps the opposite problem, which is poster syndrome of people who think they're fully qualified to do something, but actually were, inappropriately promoted to some role or don't deserve to be where they're at is probably more what I suffer from. So I'm excited to dig into this topic. Tell me let's first define terms, because I always like to do that. Define for me, how would you define imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So it is this experience that people have it's an experience that exists and persists where people question their competence, their legitimacy, even when there is objective evidence that shows they're accomplished, they're achieving, but they still question. They think people overestimate their competence, and the fear is that at any minute they're going to be outed as a fraud. Everyone's going to figure out I don't really know what I'm doing, and they're all gonna figure out that I'm a fraud.
Okay, so that's the classic definition of maybe self-definition at McKinsey. Everybody calls themselves, or they would refer to other people at the firm as insecure overachievers. It's probably not unique to
Yes.
McKinsey, but certainly commonly phrase you'd hear a lot there. Um, to your knowledge, is this a recent phenomenon, or did the ancient Greeks feel that way? I mean, is this something relatively new? And if so, when did it come about?
Well, it was identified in 1978, but I am quite certain it likely existed before that. And in fact, I think there are evolutionary roots to this, and we can talk about that if you want. But it was officially identified in 1978 by two women psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they originally called it the imposter phenomenon and believed that it only existed in high achieving women. And then, interestingly, our culture rebranded it as a syndrome, which I think is probably not a coincidence that a bunch of high achieving women have some insecurity and all of a sudden people think it's a disease or a pathology. So part of what I talk about in the book is calling for a cultural rebranding and going back to calling this the imposter phenomenon or imposter experience or imposterism, because this is something that affects a huge number of people. And the prevalence rates vary quite a bit. You can find studies anywhere from 9% to 86%, but most studies find between like 40 and 70%. And so, if this is something that's happening to most of us, then it's certainly not a disease or disorder or pathology, right? To call it a syndrome. So it's been around for a long time. It affects a lot of people. And like I said, I think there are even evolutionary reasons that so many of us have these thoughts and feelings.
Okay, um, and so that's very interesting history of this, that it was kind of named relatively recently. And what's your sense of it? Is this something that you think has, you know, like been with us for millennia? Did European aristocrats feel like, oh, why should I be a duke? I mean, what did I do? I just was born a duke, but, a son of a duke, and now I'm a duke. Like,
Yeah,
what did I do to deserve this? Or did clerics feel that way, or authors? Or is
I
this
think
something more,
so.
more, or is this something more recent in human history, that something about the modern world makes us
I
feel
sus-
insecure?
I suspect that there has been a type of this around for a long time. And the reason I say that is if you think about early humans, like cave people humans, early humans, we didn't have sharp claws, we didn't have sharp teeth, we didn't run at high speeds, we had each other. And early humans who hunted and gathered and traveled together had a survival advantage. And so it made sense to always be checking your status in the group. Do I measure up? Do I add value? Am I competent enough? Am I good enough? Because if the answer to any of those questions is no, then I risk being ousted from my tribe. And that is a literal life or death situation. And so, I think when you think of evolution and the fittest who survived, it's the people who engaged in social comparison. It's the people who worried that they were going to be found out for being less than, that ended up, making sure that they didn't get kicked out of the tribe and checking their status. And so I do think that this has probably been around forever. But of course, technology and other modern advances, certainly social media, I think have created a context where this is just like on steroids.
You mentioned status a few times. Over the past year or two, I've read a couple books that I found fascinating on status. One was, I think, Status and Culture, I think by David Marks, and then another one was The Status Game, and I forget the author. Talk to me about how does kind of status relate to imposter phenomenon, let's call it.
Well, the imposter thoughts and feelings. Now, let me first say there's not a lot of research on this. So if you put, imposter syndrome into a Google search, you'll get hundreds of millions of hits, or maybe it's tens of millions, but it's a lot. If you search in a scientific database like PubMed, it's hundreds rather than hundreds of millions. So there has not been a lot of really good, rigorous science done on this. And I feel like that's important to know because a lot of what we're talking about out there is their hypotheses more than answers to what are otherwise empirical questions. So that said, going back to this idea about status, one thing we do know from research, the little bit that's out there, is that these imposter thoughts and feelings appear to be positively correlated with success. So the more successful you are, the more likely you are to have these thoughts and feelings. And that was really fascinating to me. It's what got me interested in studying this. It wasn't so much that it existed. It made sense to me that it existed, especially, for me personally, early on in my career, I didn't know as much. So it sort of made sense that I worried that I didn't know as much. But I thought for sure, once I racked up more achievements and had greater, standing or status professionally, that I would kind of outrun these thoughts and feelings. And of course, that didn't end up happening. And the more I looked into this and started asking people about it and doing research on it, I found that, in fact, the opposite is true. And I just think that's fascinating. We don't know exactly why, but the main hypothesis is the more you know, the more you're expected to know, right? Like as you grow from, say the mailroom clerk up to the CEO, of course, you're expected to know much more, even though you may not feel like you know as much more as you're supposed to. And what Valerie Young, who's another person who specializes in this area, she says, now you have a reputation to defend, that may be playing a role too. So, I don't know if that really answers your question about status exactly, but ask it. Give me a follow-up question if there's more that you want to know that I'm not really answering there.
All right. So you talked earlier about how people can feel imposter syndrome even though they have facts at their disposal that would suggest that they are well qualified for whatever role they're in. So what do you think it is that drives that? It's one thing if you're in a role and you really are unqualified for it. That'd be one thing. You should feel like an imposter, I guess. If they but if you are relatively well qualified, at least compared to your peers, what do you think is it that makes us think that other people who are in similar roles are well qualified, even if their kind of LinkedIn or their resume suggests that they have similar backgrounds to us and they're no more qualified than us? That what makes us think that other people are more competent than we are? So someone who said, well, like, look, I'm kind of an idiot. I'm not really well qualified, but these other folks doing similar things, they're kind of idiots and not really well qualified either. So we're all sort of similarly don't know what we're doing, right? We're all just kind of making it up as we go along. If you're a CEO and you really know well some other top CEOs, and you're like, yeah, we're all just kind of making it up and no one has the answers, then you could say, well, I'm not qualified, but no one is. So that I'm kind of I'm not an imposter. Like
Yeah.
there's no one well qualified. So what is it that makes us think, yeah, that other people are well qualified and we're not?
I think this is actually fairly complex, and I think there's lots of different possibilities. One is that we don't actually talk much about this. Like, how many CEOs have you talked to who admit to not feeling qualified? And so we sit here in our own little space going, oh my God, everyone knows more than me, and they're more competent than me, they're more qualified than me. I'm the I'm the only one who doesn't know what I'm doing or who's a fraud. The more you start talking about this to other people, the more you learn just how common it is. And these assumptions we make that other people are qualified or they believe that they're qualified don't really pan out. So that's one piece. Another piece is, when you said you're a poster, not an imposter, that immediately makes me think of the Dunning Kruger cognitive bias. So we have this group of people who overestimate their knowledge or skills or competence, and they're not even competent enough to realize that they're not competent. Like, they're not smart enough to know they're not smart. And I'm not saying that's you as the poster, but your joke made me think about that. So we have these people who are overconfident and underqualified. So that's another, sort of portion. And then I think we really cannot ignore the social and cultural influences here. So like I said, in the 70s, when this was thought to only impact high achieving women, something that was called a phenomenon was quickly rebranded as syndrome, and that's sexism. And if you look at, this is a hypothesis that hasn't really been empirically tested yet. But my hypothesis, and others have said the same, is that the people who are more prone to this are those who have had some experiences with marginalization. So if you're a woman who's been told you don't belong in male spaces, or you're a person of color who's been told you don't belong in white spaces, or a gay person who's been told you don't belong in straight spaces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then it stands to reason you're going to question whether you belong in these spaces. And, it was not so long, when this was identified in the 70s, I mean, women weren't allowed to get their own credit cards or bank loans until the 70s, right? Like, my mother's generation, I'm Gen X. So my mother's generation, you could be a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, or a mother. So if you tried to be an entrepreneur or you dared to go into STEM spaces, of course, you're going to be told you don't belong in those spaces. And of course, there's endless examples like that. And so I think that lends a lot. That's a learning experience that influences people developing some self-doubt, right? So there's evolution. We were built to question whether we measure up because there's a survival advantage. There's the social cultural learning history and experiences of marginalization. And then, of course, other aspects of our learning history, the way we're parented, the way we're raised. If you had parents who were very critical, or the opposite, even if you had parents who overpraised you for things you kind of knew you didn't really deserve to be praised on, any of these experiences can, end up being internalized in a way that makes you question your competence. And then because we're not all talking about these insecurities, we assume that we're the only ones and that everyone else has it together. And then, add social media and how we're looking at everybody's highlight reels and how they all seem very successful and happy. It's sort of this breeding ground for this kind of comparison and insecurity.
Yes. I'd say most people are less impressive when you start talking to them in person compared to what you would imagine or expect.
Yeah.
This person's a $100 million
right.
sold them $100 million company. You meet them in person, they're just kind of figuring it out as
They're
go
not
along.
that special, right? They may have more confidence, but they don't necessarily have more skill or real specialness.
So let's talk about some things that someone who experiences imposterism can do about it, or should they do something about it? You mentioned that it could actually be a positive in terms of your career success. So tell us about some of the recommendations of your book in terms of how to deal with this phenomenon or
Yeah.
ism. I don't want to call it a
These is
syndrome.
this, but yeah, you can call it anything other than syndrome. Yeah. Well, that, and I do still call it that sometimes because it is really the term that people recognize most, but it's also problematic. So I think where my stance and my book are different from everything else that's out there is a lot of the advice you come across is either, the most modern advice is kind of listen, this is a systemic and organizational problem. This is not a you problem. So don't even say you have imposter syndrome. Like, let's just forget this thing even exists. And I actually think I agree that this is a systemic and organizational issue, but I also think if we sit around waiting for systems and organizations to change, we're going to be waiting a long time and meanwhile suffering when we're feeling, insecure and having some self-doubt. And so I think it's kind of a both and. Yes, we need to identify the ways in which systems are promoting this and try to make change there, and also give individuals the tools to be able to manage this so that it's not getting in the way of them having the life and career that they want. And so I think the way we tackle that at the individual level is through psychological flexibility. And what that means, well, let me say how other people tackle it first. The most common thing you find is 5 ways to boost your confidence. Here's how to start thinking positively. Stop questioning yourself. And if people are able to do that, great. But what I have found with myself, my clients, is that is a really hard sell, that because of evolution and learning history, all things that we can't erase, all things that are baked into us, it's really hard to change an I'm not good enough story. It's really hard to kind of force yourself to feel more confident. And so what I promote in the book is not trying to force your thoughts and feelings to be a certain way, but to change your relationship to them so that they're not in charge of what you're choosing to do or not do. And that's through psychological flexibility. And what that means is your ability to be in this one present moment, aware of and open to all of your internal experiences. So emotions, physiological sensations, urges, thoughts, etc., to allow those to be as they are, and to make choices based on your deeply held personal values. So who you want to be, what you want to stand for, the life that you want to live. So the goal is building psychological flexibility. The way that you become more psychologically flexible is kind of threefold. So one is identifying your values so that you know where you want to be heading. And then when you recognize the way in which thoughts and feelings get in the way of you heading in that direction, you change your relationship to them in 2 ways. One is through willingness or acceptance. And the easy way to think about that is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Like, think about how much your life would change if you were willing to feel uncomfortable. And then the other is by changing your relationship to your thoughts. So instead of kind of treating thoughts as truths with a capital T, letting them be these like mini dictators in your brains, you can learn to sort of unhook, to observe, to get some distance, and ask yourself, if I listen to this thought, is it going to move me toward the life and career I want, or is it going to keep me hanging back in some way? And so you're becoming a much more conscious, deliberate decider about what you want your life to look like, and changing your relationship to those thoughts and feelings so they're not the ones making that decision, but your values are really in charge.
Okay, so what's your take on the following approaches? Some additional approaches. I'm curious. One approach is to try to take. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's possible to say just stop questioning yourself. Like, how could you do that? Like,
Right. You can't.
But what about people who try to take a fact-based approach and says, okay, go and investigate people who are in a similar position than you. If you're now going to be giving a speech in front of 1,000 people, like, you'd say, oh, who am I to give the speech? Well, actually, don't just sort of imagine, but really get to know some other speakers who are giving talks as well, and speak with them, get to know them one-on-one, and then like learn their background and find out that they're no more impressive than you on a factual basis or something, right? Or if they're a CEO, like, try to get to know some other CEOs, and are they really more capable than you? Why do you feel that way? What's your take on trying to actually that kind of comparison type approach
Yeah. So I think this can be useful, but there's sort of a but or an it depends. So the way I think about this, someone told me this strategy and I thought this was brilliant. It's similar to what you're saying. So as a book author, it's hard to be an author. You don't always get the sales numbers you want. You might get some bad reviews, which are very painful. And so I've heard people talk about go to Stephen King's, Goodreads page or one of your favorite authors who you just think is like the most brilliant, talented person, and go read their reviews. And you'll find a whole bunch of one-star reviews, even for these incredibly, successful people that you think are good authors. So that's similar to what you're saying. It's sort of a data gathering exhibition so that oh, even people who are talented have this happen to them, and et cetera. Now, I think that can be helpful, but I also think it tends to be temporary. So what you're talking about is, okay, I'm feeling really insecure and self-conscious, and I don't like that feeling. And so what I'm going to do is go talk to these CEOs or look at these other book reviews. And when I do that, that's going to make me feel better temporarily. But these thoughts and feelings are going to come back. With 100% certainty, I can tell you they're going to come back because this is just what brains do. We are built with an inner critic that is designed to try to protect us from failure, from humiliation, from rejection. And so these thoughts and feelings will continue to happen. And you've now taught yourself the only way that I can feel better is if I go on this fact-finding mission. And so you can end up in a bit of a loop where instead of learning how to just be with those feelings and move on, you're getting almost like more stuck in this need to feel better. Like an easy way to think about it is like addiction. If you're just thinking about this model, what I'm talking about is called negative reinforcement. And so if you think about somebody, say, who's an alcoholic, they have cravings and it's uncomfortable. So they go drink and they feel better. But now the next time they have cravings, what do they need to do to feel better? They need to go drink, and they get stuck in this kind of loop. And anything that we're doing or not doing to avoid a feeling we don't like having, we run the risk of being put into that negative reinforcement loop. Does that make sense the way I explained it?
Yeah, it does. So that's like one approach of trying to actually compare yourself. I'm curious to hear your reaction to another approach, like very different, which would be acknowledge, oh, maybe I am not super qualified, but you know what? Who cares? I'm going to, number one, just sort of enjoy this while I'm in this position and just sort of have fun with it. Or number two, look, if I fail, that's okay. I'm just going to treat this as a kind of experiment / opportunity to test something out. And, maybe I'm not qualified to give a speech in front of 1,000 people, but I'm just going to, kind of see what happens and do it.
Yeah.
And, maybe there's better speakers out there. That's okay. And if I get booed or something, that's okay. I'll get some
I think
learning from
that is a much better approach. That is a very healthy approach, because essentially what's going on when we feel anxious and self-doubt, it's the discomfort with uncertainty that's really driving a lot of those feelings. I don't know if I'm going to succeed. I don't know how this is going to go. I don't know what other people really think of me. And we hate uncertainty. Right. And that also is evolutionarily programmed. The early humans who avoided uncertainty or resolved uncertainty had a survival advantage. They were less likely to be eaten out on the savannah. Right. And so we're built to avoid uncertainty and to dislike uncertainty. And so what you're basically describing is, I'm going to learn how to be okay with uncertainty. I'm going to say, you know what? I don't actually know where I land on the competence measurer. I don't know if I'm as competent or qualified as these other people. And that's okay. I don't need to know. I can take this risk. I can put myself out there because it's important to me, because I want to spread this message. And so I'm going to take the risk and do it. And even if it doesn't go great, I can handle it. So the other thing we know about brains is that we overestimate the likelihood that bad things are going to happen, and we underestimate our ability to cope with it. And the only way we can kind of recalibrate those expectations is by doing it, is by testing it out. And so you get out there and you do the thing, And it probably doesn't go as poorly as you think it's going to, but even if it does, you can handle it. And this is how you learn, and this is how you get better. And of course, that takes a thicker skin. It's the harder thing to do than avoiding or than doing the data gathering thing that you said earlier, because it requires that you're doing hard things in the presence of pain. Yeah. You have to be willing to do it scared.
Yeah, I've done plenty of things that have bombed, but I think the realization is, number one, to treat it almost like a lark or just like a learning, test, whatever, but also to realize that most people are not paying attention to you. and if your thing bombs, most people are not going to remember it or notice. But anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So, get away.
Yeah, it's true.
I want to, could you please recap your suggestions? So you went through several of them, but just like recap it in in a kind of a key takeaway. So if someone wants to remember, okay, here's my 3 approaches, just like 10 or 15 words each, like what's the kind of key capsule there if someone wants to test this out?
I'm going to say, first of all, the imposter experience is just part of being a normal human. It doesn't mean you're broken. And so it's not something that needs to be fixed. But when these thoughts and feelings are causing you some difficulty, you can change your relationship to them in 2 ways. 1, get comfortable being uncomfortable. And you can practice that a lot of different ways, which I can share some of those if you want, or I have some strategy. You can tell me if you want me to share those offline or online.
No, this is good. Okay, so number 1, we'll get back to that one. Number 1 then is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable. Yeah. All right, we'll get back to that one, but I can remember that. You can
handle it.
I can remember that.
All right.
Okay. Number 2.
The next is thoughts are not facts. Stop letting your thoughts bully you into behavior.
Okay, thoughts are not facts. All right.
Right? You're going to choose how to respond to your thoughts rather than just, being a puppet to them, letting them be your puppet master. And then the last thing would be to get really clear on your values. What kind of life and career do you want? Who do you want to be? How do you want to show up? And let that really be your guide. And I have a great metaphor that's pretty memorable. If you want me to share that might be helpful.
Of course, I would love it if you would share it.
Okay. So this is my favorite. So this is, if you think about yourself and your life as a ship, you're on a journey and you're floating through the water, and all of a sudden a very thick fog rolls in and you think, well, this is dangerous. I shouldn't keep going on my journey. I really need to drop anchor and wait for this fog to pass. And the fog, of course, is your thoughts and feelings, your self-doubt, your imposterism, your anxiety. But the problem with dropping anchor is, what if those thoughts never clear? What if the fog doesn't go away? Now you're stuck, you're stagnant, you're no longer moving forward on this journey. But there is a way to move forward even in the presence of that fog, and that's the lighthouse. And the lighthouse is your values. You can look to your values as a beacon to guide you forward, even when that thick fog of painful thoughts and feelings is there with you. And it might be slower and it might be, more scary, but you can still continue to move forward on this journey when you have your values to be your guide.
Okay, so get the lighthouse, or if we're in blue ocean waters, we might say use GPS, but I think I get the point.
Yeah.
So, and let's talk about number 1. So I might, so get comfortable being uncomfortable, maybe lean into discomfort.
Yes.
One thing that I've been doing this year, just to kind of get myself in a daily habit of that, is the first thing I do in the morning is literally the first thing. I get out of bed, walk to the bathroom, I take a 2-minute cold shower. I time it on my phone.
Love it.
And which is uncomfortable. It does not get more comfortable after 10 months of doing this, but it is a way of just sort of preparing me throughout the day to lean into discomfort. What are some of your tips around how to get comfortable about being get comfortable with discomfort?
So that is a perfect example of exactly what to do. And I think of it as training, that like if you told me you wanted to run a marathon, but you had never even walked around the block, you're not going to go do 26.2 this weekend. You're going to train with easier things. A cold shower is a perfect example of that. If what you want to do is give a TED talk and you're absolutely terrified, you're not going to go do that this weekend. go take some cold showers and start getting comfortable being uncomfortable so you can ultimately graduate to the TED Talk at some point. So other ways that I do this are you can use your five senses. So you might brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand. You might eat foods that you don't particularly like. I do this with clients eating Bean Boozled jelly beans, which are the jelly beans that come in like vomit flavor and Old Dirty Bandage. But at the end of the day, they're just jelly beans. You can watch like the last 5 minutes of Marley and Me to make space for sadness. You can watch a politician who you don't like. Now, you're not learning like willingness or acceptance of their messages. What you're doing is looking for stimuli to trigger discomfort inside so that you can then practice being with your discomfort, right? That's what that's about. It's about making space and opening up and allowing yourself to feel uncomfortable. And how you trigger that, this is where you can get creative and playful. Yeah. Showers are a great way to do it. And there's many other ways. Anyone who does yoga is familiar with your teacher saying, cross your legs or cross your hands. Okay, now cross them the funny feeling way. And we're all like, oh, I hate the funny feeling way. Right. You can do that every day to practice getting comfortable being uncomfortable. You don't even have to do yoga. I'm sitting, cross-legged right now, and I just switched my legs. So now they're the funny feeling way. And I'm just going to hang out like this while we talk.
A couple other exercises that I've seen along the journey has been on the subway or on the bus, just ask someone if you can have their seat.
Oh, yeah.
Don't even give a reason.
Yes, anything that's outside of the social mores. Yeah. I used to take my clients to do this. Anyone who has social anxiety, we do things like this, that they're called like social mishap exposures, where you're deliberately doing something that, I'm thinking of a guy I had when I was in, he was walking around Kenmore Square in Boston, asking people for directions to Kenmore Square. And he had his shirt buttoned the wrong way and his hair messed up. And he literally thought someone was going to call 911 and he was going to be taken to an inpatient unit. And of course that didn't happen. And everyone was very nice. And he had someone say, oh, honey, you're in Kenmore Square. Can I help you find somewhere specific? And then you learn the bad thing you're afraid is going to happen doesn't happen, and you can handle it.
Yeah. Or even just make eye contact with someone when you're walking down the street and don't be the first to look away, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we talked about lean into discomfort. Just get used to the idea that it's okay to be uncomfortable.
They're just feelings. And they're not going to hurt you. They're temporary.
And the next one was thoughts are not facts. So tell us a little bit, some exercises or things to do to get used to that idea.
Yeah. So what we're really wanting to do is create distance. And then in that space, this is where you can make these values-driven choices. And so my two favorite ways to do this, they're very simple. The first is like take a thought that gives you trouble. So let's just take I'm not good enough, because everyone has some version of an I'm not good enough story. So say to yourself, I'm not good enough, and notice how that feels. And now say, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, and notice how that feels. And now try, I'm noticing I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, and see how that feels.
Oh,
so,
I like that.
So what do you notice, Will?
Yeah, that three-part, the making it explicit about, it's a very metacognition kind of thing going on. Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah, like you're getting some distance and you're going, oh, this is just a thing that's happening in my head. This isn't reality. These are just sounds and syllables and words that I'm noticing. The other way I like to do it is to give your inner critic a name. And so, mine has always been Sheila. Don't know why, don't know or dislike any Sheilas, just happened to come to me one day. So now when that inner critic gets loud, I go, okay, Sheila, I know you're just trying to protect me from failure and humiliation and rejection, but I've got this. And it sort of kind of keeps it over here, like keeps it separate, where I then have this space to make a different choice. And I've had clients name it the bully, the dictator, just the inner critic. It doesn't have to be a human name. I got, before my book even officially came out, someone somehow read it early and gave me a 1-star book review, which is it's pretty painful when that happens and your book isn't even out yet. Thankfully, the rest of them have all been lovely. But when I was telling my writing partners about it, because I was feeling sad and anxious, my friend Emily said, "Not today, Kevin." And now that's become one of my techniques. When my inner critic pops up, I go, "Not today, Kevin. You can have your opinion about this, but I'm going to move forward with, writing the books and sharing the books and doing whatever it is that I'm doing that I might be feeling a little bit insecure about."
So this idea of naming that inner critic, that seems to me kind of sympathetic with the kind of theme of Stephen Pressfield's nonfiction works, the War of Art and Turning Pro, and his other books in that series. How would you say that your thinking here kind of relates to his, if you're familiar with his books?
I'm actually not. Who is it? This sounds like someone I need to have on my podcast. Are they still living and modern?
Yeah. So Stephen Pressfield, he wrote the War of Art, playing, of course, on the Art of War title.
Art of War, yeah.
And that was he's a fiction author, the author of The Legend of Bagger Vance, and a screenwriter. And he's written a lot of books about kind of ancient Greece, like fictional books on Sparta and so forth. And but he's also has the side thing of writing that came out of the War of Art, Turning Pro, and he has a couple others in that series. Do the Work, I think, is another one.
That one I've heard of.
With this idea of he labels this force the resistance, and very much personifies it as this evil force in the universe that is attempting to divert you from, creating the thing that you were meant to create, and that everyone suffers from it and experiences it, and you can never actually overcome it. You can only defeat it one day at a time by, acknowledging that it exists and just refusing to accept that it will divert you from your path. Would be
exactly.
His point.
I'm gonna have to check him out. That sounds perfectly consistent with yes, I completely agree with those messages. And even the word resistance, I don't know if this fits with his work, but a lot of the influences, I do a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, and that's where this idea of psychological flexibility comes from. It's the goal of ACT. And ACT is influenced quite a bit by ancient Eastern religions like Buddhism, where in Buddhism they say pain times resistance equals suffering. Pain is just, the cost of a ticket to being human, right? Like none of us get out of this life without experiencing pain. But how we respond to the pain is the part we get to choose. And if we resist, then we create suffering. But if we turn down the resistance, then we turn down the suffering. So we have to have the pain, but the suffering is more of a choice. And that's all about whether we resist the pain or whether we learn how to lean into it, basically.
I think that you have on your website some different resources. Would you like to mention those? I know you have at least a quiz and perhaps some other things.
I do. Gosh, what is on there? I've got, I think there's a 3 tips to living a mighty life that kind of summarizes some of the things that my last book was called Be Mighty. So that's why the word mighty is in there. And that has some of the things that we've talked about today. I have 2 quizzes. One is to identify your subtype of imposter. So we all try to avoid being outed as a fraud in a number of different ways. So one is called the perfectionist. I'm what you would call the expert, which is the person who needs to read one more book, take one more class, listen to one more podcast. Like it's never enough knowledge and skill to feel like you're legitimate, right? And there's 3 others. And so you can take that quiz to find out your subtype. And then I also talk in the book about the different ways that we tend to avoid. So for that one, there's 5 of those too. I'm the doer. That's the person that does go, 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 do, super busy. And then you don't feel your anxiety and self-doubt as long as you're always doing. And then there's the opposite of that, the person who's more of an avoider. And there's 3 other subtypes there. So there's quizzes for both of those if people are interested in a little more of that self-awareness and then once you know those things, you're much better at spotting them and recognizing the ways that they might be getting in the way of cultivating the life and the career that you want.
And where can people find those resources? Share your link.
Right on my website, which is just jillstoddard.com, and my last name is spelled Stoddard.
Fantastic. And we will include that link in the show notes. Jill, It was
Awesome.
such a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for sharing tips on overcoming imposter phenomena.
You are so welcome. Well, thanks so much for having me. It was really fun to chat with you.